Good afternoon, viewers and listeners. Welcome back to the Free Marketeers podcast. Thanks for joining us on this latest edition on the 3rd of July. 6 months of the year have passed very quickly, I think, for me at least. 6 months of lockdown, of destroying the world's economy all over a virus. And who knows what the next 6 months has in store for us, but we're all in this together. So let's see what happens going forward. We've got quite a few topics to cover today, so I'm hoping we can get through all of it. Martin and Jacques, thank you, both of you, for your time, for joining me today. Always a pleasure to talk to you guys. We're going to start off talking about what happened in Cape Town this past week. As I'm sure everyone has seen by now, the video on social media of a man being forcefully, I think forcefully is maybe being kind, but forcefully being expelled from his shack. On this topic, I wanted to make a note of a High Court judgment in Johannesburg that declared unconstitutional warrantless searches of private homes and the people inside, and it's given Parliament 2 years to fix Section 13(7)(c) of the SAPS Act. Now, just that's me spitballing and saying these two things are linked. But Martin, I think if you could start here, maybe if you could comment on that High Court judgment, then the matter of the City of Cape Town, and maybe other factors that you think were at play in this eviction.
Yeah, so I don't know anything about the judgment, but what I am assuming is that it's based on the right to privacy in the Constitution, which I think is extremely clear that you can't search someone's private property without a warrant. I know that South African law has because our Criminal Procedure Act somewhat precedes the Constitution by a few years, and a lot of our police-related law is the same. There have been some exceptions to this. For instance, if there is a suspicion, for instance, that evidence will be destroyed, then they don't need a warrant. If there's a reasonable suspicion that a crime is being committed, then they don't need a warrant. So there have been some exceptions to that. So I'm not surprised that the court has finally come to the conclusion that that should be rectified. I will read the judgment and see. But when you link that to what happened in Cape Town, I think that's interesting, because shacks are not formalized property, and I don't think anywhere in the country they are regarded as the property of those who built them, and that I think is a problem. I think that's part of a bigger problem in South Africa of property rights not extending nearly as far as they should have, since we have since the right to private property has been recognized at least in the interim Constitution 1993. So that's still a big gap in our law, I think. But another factor is that these shacks, apparently, I don't have all the details, were built on, I find this to be very funny, they were built on city property, right? This idea of property of the municipality. And this is the argument that is now being used to justify the shacks being demolished and justify people being dragged out of these shacks. It's because they have invaded municipal property. Now, I don't want to get political, so let's just say that there's a different party that governs that municipality, and that party has historically identified itself as the pro-private property party. The issue here is they are undermining a very important classically liberal fact, and that is that private property and so-called state or municipal or public property are not the same thing. And by trying to paint them as being the same thing, in that government's land can be invaded and therefore government can use whatever force is reasonably necessary to remove the invaders from the property, that really strikes at the very heart of private property and of the classical liberal idea of private property. I mean, the fact is that if you are a tax-paying South African citizen and you see a piece of so-called state land, that is, as far as I'm concerned, that is either unowned, which means it's you can do on it what you want, or that's your property. It can only be one of those two options. It can never be the so-called state's property. It's the state didn't pay for it, you paid for it. And that is the principle I'm applying with this very case. I don't think it's ideal that people went onto the property without permission and set up shacks. I think there's they might have a political agenda from a different political party by doing that, but that's somewhat irrelevant. The fact is, they went onto property that I think is at best theirs or at best unowned. So the force that was used to remove them from that type of so-called public property, I think, is totally unreasonable. I think it strikes at the very heart of various constitutional provisions, including the right to private property and the right to housing. Of course, the right to dignity. And of course, the common law rule that the police should never use any more force than is necessary to secure compliance. And clearly, they were using far, far, far excessive force in doing what they were doing there. So I find that to be very, very disturbing. Of course, if it was private property, it's a different story. Still, don't use that type of force. At least let the man get dressed. But it wasn't private property; it was state property. I think it illustrates the fact that we have a long way to go to normalize, I guess is the word, property rights in South Africa, and to make sure that everyone is aware of what is supposed to be theirs and what is theirs. And I think that if we had normalized that, if this individual had a piece of property or was able to, and I'm assuming he has a house somewhere, which he doesn't own. So if he did own that, then I don't think any of this would have happened. So that is what I think needs to be top of our agenda. We need to start dishing out title deeds for people on so-called state land. And I think that can only lead to less tension and more harmony. And that will avoid things like this happening again.
Jacques, just before I ask you to comment, I just want to make maybe the meta point, as I'm wont to do. But yeah, people wanted big government. People wanted strong government. This is what happens when you get so-called strong government. Of course, not strong in the right way, not based on the right principles. But this, to me, is one of the effects of that sort of worldview. A government that can give you housing and whatever else also has the power to take that away in ways that it thinks is appropriate, which would infringe on any of our common sensibilities. But Jacques, if you'd like to comment on this, please go ahead.
Yeah, I concur with everything Martin has said. I mean, this is just, again, a sheer violation of human rights, of that person's right to live a dignified life as enshrined in the Constitution. And this is simply also just the tragedy of the commons. I mean, I agree with Martin that where there's state land that's not really being utilized for any purpose, take the land, subdivide it, and give the people that are squatting their title deeds. It's as simple as that. Preferably, you should attempt to privatize as much state-owned land as possible, because the state as an entity, as Martin pointed out, they did not pay for anything, you paid for it. And we say it's our tax money for a reason. So the state is basically, when it refers to state-owned land, state-owned property, is basically trying to get its bread buttered on both sides here. Basically saying, okay, well, this government owns it, but the people own it, but not the individuals, even though the individuals were forced to pay for it. And but you technically own it as part of the communal society, even though technically you don't own it, and you don't really have use rights unless we say you have use rights, etc., etc. This is all just a big muddy pool of confusion with respect to state land. And I mean, but just to touch on what they actually did to the guys, they literally dragged him naked out of his shack, and they did get suspended. But now we have officials from the city of Cape Town condemning their actions. But what we want to see is real action, because they are trying to treat the symptom of the problem. They're not trying to treat the core problem here, which is the state owns too much land. Subdivide the land, give title deeds to people like these who were effectively the part of the marginalized and disadvantaged community in South Africa.
I think you're both very right in pointing out possible solutions. I admire that this got picked up so quickly on social media and people express their outrage, but that only goes so far if you don't actually try and address the underlying issues, as I think you've both pointed to. Jacques, I'll go straight to you then for the next topic, the Auditor General's report on municipalities and municipal spending. You can give us, I guess, the highlighted figures if you'd like, but just an overview obviously there's a lot more irregular spending than in previous years, just from what I could see as an overview. We did put out an infographic on this that viewers and listeners you can find on both our Facebook and Twitter pages. And then, Jacques, after you, Martin, will ask you for your expertise on the numbers.
Yeah, so I mean, the regular expenditure has increased by something like 30% up to just over 32 billion rand. I think the other figure was over 40 or for around 40% of total municipal revenue is used for wages and salaries. And then you have something basically called an unconditional grant given to municipalities to, do basic administration, provide basic services, give it to national governments. It's unconditional. You get that whether, it's unconditional. And I think the wages and salaries, if I'm not mistaken, was 160% of that unconditional grant. And then with respect to things like water and sanitation, about 41% of municipalities did not have either a plan or an approved plan to do either water maintenance or sanitation system maintenance. 21% did not have an approved plan to do road maintenance. And then when you get to the audits, I think 3% are clean audits. It's a figure as low as that. I might be mistaken on the exact figure, but it's way below 10%. So yeah, this is just absolutely terrible. And then Minister of Finance Tito Mboweni said, in his budget speech, he simply mentioned, tax reforms in order to increase tax revenue by 40 billion rand over the next 4 years. Now, on page 33 of the supplementary budget review, Treasury specifies that it will be in the form of higher income taxes when salaries and employment normalize again. So this is effectively, we're seeing ever more wasteful expenditure, yet to make up for it, government wants to take more of the fruits of your labor for them. And effectively, what they do in this country is when they tax you and then they waste the tax money, they don't really give you anything in return for it. It's effectively expropriation without compensation, because you don't really get any form of compensation, at least not to the extent that you would require under law from a government that taxes the highest effective tax rate in South Africa is about 38%. A government that takes up to 38% of people's monthly incomes, you'd expect them to compensate to that value, to compensate the people, but they're simply not. So it's effectively a form of EWC currently taking place.
Martin, I think, just before you go ahead, I'd just like to make the point about, I think most South Africans, and now I'm speaking on behalf of South Africans, but that people are okay with paying their taxes. But the more you see this sort of thing, I hope that people start questioning that relationship. I am very much against it being a given that we should just keep on giving to the state, no matter what, no matter whether they use it properly or not. I think that's something that needs to be highlighted and something that needs to be pointed out, and the conversation needs to be had. As Jacques also points out, it's a form of EWC. South Africans, a lot of poorer and middle-class South Africans struggle to pay their taxes. They still do so. They still do their best to pay them, and yet they see this incredible wastage around them. So why is there this duty or this obligation on them to continue paying their taxes?
Yeah, no, I mean, Lon Fuller, the famous legal scholar of the previous century, he spoke about reciprocity, the idea that we give something in expectation that we get something back. And if we do not get something back, then the agreement between us and government is essentially terminated. So we agree to abide by government's laws in exchange for all the goodies that government promises us. Of course, we don't want government to be promising many of these goodies, but the fact is that in South Africa, at least, this government has long, and I mean, previous governments didn't even try, but have long abandoned any idea of reciprocity. And I find concerning that South Africans, and I mean, this is a global phenomenon, but in South Africa, it's especially striking, don't seem to care. As you both know, I did a talk, I think last month, with the Cornerstone Institute on the provision of free data, which I obviously opposed, but which all of my fellow panelists very, very eagerly supported. And the point I kept making was that the government has wasted billions in resources and tax money. It has destroyed the economy, even maybe purposefully. It has done everything in its power to sap the economy dry of money and to destroy productivity. Yet there is still this desire from a lot of South Africans to give the government more power and more money. And I don't really get that. I mean, we don't have the Icelandic government in South Africa. We've never had that level of social trust here, where essentially everyone is part of the same, almost a hive mind, as many European countries seem to be, where everyone is basically on the same page. We are not on the same page in South Africa, even within so-called cultural and racial groups. There are wide differences, and everyone has their own idea of how society should be governed. And a lot of people, especially in the elite, are simply very keen on stealing money and wasting money, and not a lot of people seem to want to hold them accountable for that. So that's a problem, and it just illustrates to me the sheer necessity of limited government in South Africa. We need almost constitutional provisions that say the budget needs to be balanced, or the budget can never be more than 1% of GDP or something like that, just to put the brakes on government. And I mean, what's it, 30 billion rand of wasted expenditure, of irregular expenditure? 30 billion rand is a lot of money. That's almost enough to run a classical liberal government per se for an entire year. So that's we need very important changes. But as we all like to point out on this podcast, it really requires a mentality change amongst at least a sizable amount of South Africans to actually see what it is that is happening here and realize that government is not the solution to anything, really, and that we need to stop thinking in that way, and only then can we keep some of this money and get it to where it needs to be.
Just two things I'll mention there on your European comment. Are you saying there's a link between socialism and groupthink? And then number two, I think 2020, if nothing else, it should show people, if they sort of hear it from the right interpretation, that the massive economic harm that has been caused in this year so far is the result of unchecked government power, and of people giving government their sanction. Many people were very quick to accept that government was going to take charge and fight COVID and all this stuff, and we went along with it. And now it's just an indefinite house arrest / lockdown. We see different stages of lockdown, so we're being given back our freedoms, as it were, but we accepted the premise that if there's a threat big enough, government needs to, take care of us. So that, as you say, Martin, it requires a serious mental shift. Moving on to our next topic, and this is, of course, for both of you, as one of your many areas of expertise, legal challenges to the lockdown regulations. Just one example, the Musi Maimane, formerly of the DA, his case for schools to be closed again was dismissed. So schools will remain open, but that was one case that was brought about regulations. Any others that either of you would like to highlight, or maybe point to the next few weeks or months where you think some of the regulations might be challenged or not? I know there was also a lot of news around the DA's challenge. Maybe Jacques, if you'd like to go first.
So I would just like to point out in the case, I can't remember which court case it was. You caught me off guard here a little bit. Basically, what the judge ruled is that it is of national interest to reopen the economy because the fiscus requires the money in order to take care of people, etc., etc. I think it was in Maimane's case. Now, the problem with that reasoning is that, yes, it is in the fiscus's interest, but that is not the main justification that should be used to reopen the economy. The main justification should not be it is in government's interest. The main justification should be it is in the interest of individuals in order so that they can make a living and not actually starve to death eventually. And I've seen people make this silly point that, well, if we extend social grants, etc., then people won't starve to death. But what people do not realize is the money for grants have to come from other productive behavior. So I made the point to someone the other day is that government does not precede a market where individuals pursue their own selfish interests and trade with one another to fulfill their own subjective desires. Government does not precede that. The market precedes that. The government sort of latches onto that process of wealth creation in order to extract wealth from that process in order to fund its own activities. It is individuals pursuing their own lives and creating wealth. So for the court to argue, well, it's in the interest of the fiscus to reopen the economy. Yes, it is, but they're basically making the right argument for the wrong reasons. First of all, it should be in the interest of individuals, and that should be the main preoccupation of the court. Is they should interpret their judgments in favor of the liberty of individuals. But to be fair to the court, they did say it is so that the fiscus can provide necessary services, to those that maybe can't afford it themselves, etc., etc. Then I just want to touch on the point, people talking about, the judiciary is captured, so I'm not going to mention any names, but I think there is a specific judge in the country that might be captured, or just plain corrupt. But in general, when you look at the legal arguments that have been made in the cases now where, people were very disappointed in what the courts were ruling, is that the arguments were not that strong. They did not. The legal counsels of the applicants, were almost sort of scared to make the quote-unquote controversial arguments and go straight for the jugular. So, for instance, they challenged the rationality of the lockdown regulations instead of the reasonableness. And I mean, in the one case, the court specifically said, this is not a constitutional challenge on the tobacco ban. This is not a constitutional challenge. This is merely a challenge on the executive action, and that it is not rational. But the test for rationality is very limited in its scope. Whereas if you bring a constitutional challenge and you argue that for instance, the tobacco ban is unreasonable, then the court must do a more in-depth analysis, evaluate whether there were alternative means, etc. And then you most likely would be successful in having some of the, for instance, the ban on tobacco declared unreasonable instead of irrational, because the two things are different in law. So I do not think people should spread around this myth that the judiciary as a whole is captured, because it's simply not true. What I rather think people should be focusing on is getting legal counsels to actually make airtight arguments that can actually pass judicial muster and actually be successful.
Martin, any of that you'd like to jump in on, or maybe a different tack on the challenges to the regulations, or some of them at least?
Well, I just want to re-emphasize Jacques' first point about there is this idea almost that's very prevalent, not only amongst ordinary South Africans, but clearly amongst the intelligentsia, amongst the judges, that this crop of tax money it's just there. It's just always going to be there. Government can do whatever it wants. It can totally destroy the economy. The taxes are going to be there. Obviously, that is not true. And that's also a point that I made continuously on that Cornerstone Institute a panel discussion, which nobody really picked up on. Our taxpayers are leaving. Our high net worth taxpayers are leaving this country. And you can implement as stringent financial controls as you want. They will get their money out, and they will take their intellectual and financial capital with them, and the fiscus will be dead in the water. So, I mean, there's no endless amount of tax money out there that will just be there for government to use. That's something that a lot of people need to realize, and it's a point we really need to press home, because I think it's one of the big risks that South Africa is facing, that no one is really paying any attention to. And then, yeah, I totally agree with Jacques. There's an issue with advocates in South Africa, especially, who take a very conservative approach to litigation. I think it's the way that our bar councils really inculcate that culture that comes from the very, I guess, conservative British legal tradition that we have, whereby Parliament is sovereign. and that if you want to challenge legislation, it needs to be on technical or procedural grounds. Rationality is a very technical-ish ground. So a lot of lip service is paid to our supreme value-based constitution, but when it comes to litigation, advocates always try to go for a conservative approach. Now, sometimes that pays off. I think it's the Liberty Fighters case, the Brain, I think, of a few weeks ago. There, the judge was very courageous, and I mean that as a compliment. But if you've ever watched Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister, you know that when a politician does something courageous, it's actually very dangerous. So I think that was very dangerous for the judge to do. Because a lot of conservative legal advocates have criticized this judgment and said that it's incorrect. I don't agree, and I'm glad to see that Professor Koos Malan and Professor Ilse Grobler wrote a case analysis a few weeks ago in Afrikaans on LitNet, where they also agree with Judge Dennis, it's not Dennis Davis, it's Norman Davis, saying that he got it essentially right. There were some mistakes, but that was essentially correct. But then the Cape High Court, I think last week, also on a rationality-based challenge, dismissed a case with which one of our colleagues in Piaki Dlamini was involved, also and said that the challenge, the regulations were rational. And then, of course, the tobacco judgment, the court also said it was rational. So Judge Davis applied, I would say, a substantive rationality, whereas these two later cases applied a very technical, low threshold type of rationality, which is more in line with what we've seen from our courts in the past, but is, I think, somewhat out of step with what the Constitution envisages. So, but that being said, I agree with Jacques that the challengers really need to realize that we have something called Section 36 in the Constitution, which sets out how government may limit rights. And it's actually quite a strict formula that government must comply with. And unfortunately, no one is challenging the regulations based on that, which I found bizarre. It's quite weird that nobody is invoking Section 36 and saying there are less restrictive means that government can pursue, which you recently mentioned in a TV interview, Chris, like track and trace, etc. Not to say that that doesn't violate your privacy, but it's less restrictive than what we're currently experiencing. And other things as well, look at the nature of the right. For instance, on level 5, the right to freedom of movement is not simply limited. I would argue it was totally suspended. And I think any Section 36 analysis of that should conclude that, no, this isn't a limitation. This is a suspension, and therefore you can't do that. You need to, you can limit it, but you can't suspend it. So that is what I think future challenges should do. Take Section 36 and make that argument, say that the lockdown, especially at the higher levels, do not comply with the formula set out therein. And that if government wants to continue as it is, it needs to declare a state of emergency. But maybe not at lower levels of the lockdown anymore. But I think still some regulations are just beyond the pale. Yeah, so I think there will be more challenges going forward, especially if there are some rumors that the Section 5 will be reimposed in Gauteng at least. And I think that may prompt some people to take some legal action and say that this is totally ridiculous for various reasons. Maybe here rationality could come back again in that this is simply the number of tests confirming that more people are being infected. It's not necessarily a hotspot. I mean, the hotspot may be in the North Cape, but they haven't tested a lot of people there. So that's just an aside, a technical point. So yeah, I foresee some more challenges, and I encourage more challenges. But I do think that our advocates need to drop this very British legal conservatism and look more across the pond, look at the United States, look at how their lawyers have approached constitutional litigation, very creative, very values-based, and I think we'll find a neat fit there for South Africa's constitutional situation.
As tomorrow is the 4th of July, I think it would be good to have a little bit of a more spirit of resistance and revolution in South Africa, in the spirit of America. I would hold that maybe some Americans have lost sight of that original resistance to overbearing government. Speaking of overbearing government, and now we're getting on to our final topic, just to set the scene a bit, Hong Kong is probably the biggest topic right now in international news. Earlier this week, a sweeping new security law was imposed on Hong Kong by the Chinese government. I would argue it undermines the semi-autonomous city's independent judiciary and it stifles freedoms. The legislation outlaws acts of subversion, secession, terrorism, and colluding with foreign forces. It bypassed Hong Kong's legislature, and its wording was kept secret until it was enacted later that day, on Tuesday. Under a deal of the handover from Britain, China guaranteed Hong Kong civil liberties as well as judicial and legislative autonomy until 2047, in a formula known as one country, two systems. Critics in the form of countries, including Britain, they say that the new law demolishes that deal, especially as China says it will have jurisdiction over some cases and has empowered its security agents to operate openly inside Hong Kong for the first time. It is also, I think, incredibly and maybe brazenly claimed global jurisdiction, saying that the new law covers national security offenses committed overseas, even by foreigners. Now, I'm going to paraphrase here, but I'll make the point that, and I can see Martin is rearing to go, but I'm paraphrasing here, and I can't remember exactly who said this quote, but the idea of if freedom is infringed anywhere, it is infringed everywhere. I think that's very much a case in this regard. I know that we've got our own challenges in South Africa, our own issues, but I think this is a very clear example of one country trying to assert its influence, as it were, over other sovereign individuals. So I'm sure both of you have quite a lot to say, and Martin, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, look, on that first point, or the last point you just made, I think South Africans should be very concerned of what happens elsewhere. I think anyone who is more freedom inclined, libertarian, classical liberal Democrat, should be extremely concerned about what happens outside of their borders, because as we saw, especially during the Cold War, communism didn't just stay inside the Soviet bloc. It was exported, and we're still living with the consequences of that. So always be aware of what's happening elsewhere and support in any way you can any struggle for freedom, so that we can all eventually be free and that there is no surprises waiting for us across the borders. But on this the security law thing, it's ridiculous. I mean, anyone with a basic familiarity with the rule of law will immediately see the issues there. So the first one is this thing about keeping the text of the law secret until the law is like promulgated into operation. That is ridiculous. That can never be how law works. The whole idea of a law is that there's consent given, and I know we libertarians tend to dispute how that consent is given, but at least in theory, consent is given democratically. Everyone knows what the law says, and you consent to that, and then it is applied on you, and it's applied on the governors as well. Obviously, the Chinese government does not care about that, and I don't think even the people of Hong Kong had any type of say in what the content of that law would be. I'm not sure if Hong Kong has any representation in the Chinese legislature. The Chinese legislature, I should say. But yeah, and then this next point, this thing about applying to foreigners. I mean, then what we are saying here now is committing treason against the People's Republic of China, which is, it's really out there. Then we're using Zoom, which I guess is a problem in itself, which so they can listen what we're saying here. It's totally off the reservation when it comes to basic principles of lawmaking and of legality and so on. So I think even in a very positivist sense, this is no law. This is not a law. It's some arbitrary diktat by a bunch of politicians that I think the people of Hong Kong should resist with all of their might. But I acknowledge that is going to be far more. It's easier said than done. Yeah, look, I don't know to what extent my views on this are well known, but I think that the United Kingdom is under a very specific obligation here to yeah, I need to be careful how I phrase my ideas around this. How they
I'll jump in there. At the very least, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, they've offered, for I think up to 3 million people from Hong Kong to come to Britain under special visas, I guess, or citizenship rules. So that to me is a very good rights moral step in the right direction. I don't think any of us are going to call for, force maybe in that regard, but at the very least, I would hope that Western governments who are that we're often told are supposed to be, the West is supposed to be the shining city on a hill and the paragon of individual rights. Well, now is the time to honor that history. If Western politicians are serious about that, now is the time to help Hong Kong people. Even if you don't take China on directly, just help in some way. Sorry, Martin, go ahead.
Yeah. Look, I agree. I think that what the UK government did seems to me to be unprecedented. So I think that in that respect, it's very good to just say that if you are someone from Hong Kong from before 1997, or I don't know what the formula is, then you have this right to come to Britain. I think that's great, but I still think it's insufficient. I don't think that there should be a distinction on who from Hong Kong comes. I think that everyone in Hong Kong is being negatively affected by China's tyrannical moves, and that this offer should be open to anyone who elects to leave. And to the extent that there shouldn't be force, I guess I agree with you at a basic level of human decency that you should never want to have force as your first option. But China has implied that it will, and it's only implied this, they haven't expressly said so, that it will stop people of Hong Kong who take the United Kingdom up on this offer. That they will stop them from leaving, and unfortunately, the UK has acknowledged that it can do, and maybe it will do nothing to hinder China from doing that. I find that to be very sad. I mean, after the Second World War, we got what people refer to as the international liberal order. Whereby there are certain states, which maybe implicitly, maybe expressly, have taken the mantle of ensuring that the brazen acts of tyranny like this do not happen again. And unfortunately, I'm seeing it. I think there's a repudiation of that international liberal order by these states themselves, which I think signals nothing more or less than the death of the Western tradition within the next few years, which I find terribly sad. The West thinks, lots of people in the West think that they need only concern themselves with themselves and the people in their countries, and that will be enough for the West to continue surviving. I definitely dispute that. I think that if you give an inch to, call it the East, the Eastern type of thinking, excluding, of course, Japan and South Korea, they have a very, very Western type of thinking, which I think is laudable. But at the Eastern type of thinking of China, of North Korea, Russia, we can talk about Putin and what he's up to nowadays. I think if you give an inch to that, then you cede the whole game. And I'm seeing too many inches being given. I think that is hugely troubling. I think it's troubling for us in South Africa as well. Knowing, I know AfriForum put out a report last month about China's influence in Africa. Some things in there are very concerning. For instance, that EWC may actually be something being pursued to enable government to provide land, specifically mining land, to the Chinese government and related companies for free or for a cheap price, so that it can extract resources and send back to China. To what extent that is totally true, I don't know, but I mean it's concerning. And I think if the West, referring I guess to the United States, to NATO, to the United Kingdom, if they step back from the role that they've traditionally played as the upholders of a very, I guess, an enlightenment or individual rights-based standard, however flawed that might be, if they step back, then we're all in trouble. I think everyone needs to be concerned then. So yeah, I'm heartened by what Boris Johnson has announced, but if they're not planning to enforce that, then I think it's empty words, and I really don't want to see that. I've been to Hong Kong. I don't know if either of you've been there. It's a a wonderful place. It's the closest thing, I guess, next to Lagos that I've seen as a manifestation of capitalism, where everyone is always working, everyone is doing something. I don't think I saw one person who looked unemployed. And the city never sleeps, quite in a very real sense. People are at their shops at 12 at night. You can feel the freedom in Hong Kong, and I will think it will be a massive loss to the world and specifically to the people of Hong Kong if the West just allows that to fade into the night and allow China to do what it wants. I think that will be a great loss.
I think one of the best things I've ever watched on Hong Kong was, I think, Milton Friedman. And people can find that online quite easily. And I'd recommend that you go and watch that just to hear him talk about it. He often, in a lot of his talks and documentaries and things, when he speaks on a topic, it's much easier for you to connect the dots, as it were, between the theory and the concrete. Jacques, anything you'd like to contribute on this matter?
Yeah, so this Hong Kong thing is extremely troubling to me. What's even more troubling is people saying, "Yeah, well, it's happening there, it doesn't affect us, yada yada yada." You know, a threat to liberty anywhere is a threat to liberty everywhere. Paraphrasing here, but and what's interesting is this has been coming for a long time. So the first time they tried to pass such a law was in 2003 during another coronavirus outbreak. And I think it was the SARS outbreak back then, yes. And now this is the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Basically, there's a second SARS virus, and again, they're trying it. But this is, a lot of analysts believe this is also due to deteriorating relations between the US and the Chinese governments. But this is extremely worrying. And what I would like to see one day, and this might be very idealistic, is Hong Kong being an independent nation, independent of China, and gaining that sort of independence with the help of Western nations, specifically with the help of NATO, in order to guard the liberties of the citizens of Hong Kong against the authoritarian measures employed by the Chinese Communist Party. Now, this is not necessarily even the people of China that want this implemented. It is the CCP. It is their doctrine, it is their ideology, and it is them that is forcing this. And what Martin mentioned on them actually being able to prevent citizens from leaving, I didn't even know that, but that is just sad. You know, it's extremely worrying that you can be prevented from trying to flee encroachments on your liberty, you know, and to the same extent that the North Korean government's doing to its own citizens. Yeah, so this is just a general opinion on the matter. You know, it all comes basically down to people do not value freedom until they see just how easily it can be lost. And I think the whole world needs to pay attention to what is happening in Hong Kong, and especially the influence that China now has in Africa, and that can very easily happen here. I mean, our government here, the South African state, has never been a friend of freedom. You know, not now, not in the past. We've never actually known freedom in South Africa. I mean, history shows you that. And what's happening now in Hong Kong should really be a wake-up call to people who think that, you know, who are complacent and think that the state has this massive interventionist role to play in society, you know, not just in the economy, because you can't really have your bread buttered on both sides. If you want a strong government, you are going to see a lot of abuses of power. You cannot have a strong interventionist government that can give you anything and everything you want, because it will also simultaneously be given the power to take everything away from you. You cannot have your bread buttered on both sides.
Just a few parting thoughts. There's a certain president who may have said something on this, but from my perspective, I find the silence, as it were, deafening, and I would very much like to hear something from the supposed defender of individual liberty, that he would say something around this latest law. I think if he is indeed that man of that character, I would like to hear that. And then just on the matter of Chinese, I guess, involvement and growth in Africa, I would like to mention to everyone to keep in mind that, you know, communism and authoritarianism, statism, they're not exclusively Chinese, as in Chinese people characteristics. They those ideas, those bad ideas, those immoral ideas can spread everywhere around the world. Communism, as it were, came to us from Germany, from Europe. So we should not make the mistake of assuming that everyone from China follows the same ideas and endorses what its government is doing. I think we should keep that in mind, because I'm worried about a growing trend of, I guess, xenophobia and bias against foreigners in South Africa and Africa, and that will increase as government control increases. The government will play up its own sort of groups that it wants to represent, and it will denigrate and scapegoat other groups if that can keep it in power. But yeah, before I go even further into a longer monologue and digress even more off the N1, I will end this episode. Jacques and Martin, thank you guys for joining me today. As I mentioned, always a pleasure. Viewers and listeners, thank you for your time today. Thanks for joining us. Please remember to like the video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and share it on all your social media platforms. Please also remember you can find the podcast on Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and a few others, also on Anchor FM. So please go and listen there if you prefer just the audio version. And also give us a rating there. 5 stars, if nothing else, will help us a lot to get the news out and boost our views. Thank you for your continued support. If you haven't yet donated to the Free Market Foundation, please consider doing so. If you followed our work during lockdown, the work we've been doing trying to cover the regulations and all the implications of the lockdown, we greatly appreciate your support. It means a lot to us. So please consider a donation if that would be possible for you. But I'll end on that note. Have a good Friday afternoon and a good weekend ahead, and we'll talk to you all again very soon. Bye-bye.